We continue now with our study of apologetics. We recall that what we've been examining in the past lectures are the options, the alternatives to give a sufficient reason to explain reality as we encounter it. And we've looked at the first option, that it is an illusion, and we have eliminated that possibility. Then the second one we looked at in great detail was that reality is self-created. And when we examined that, we saw that from an analytical perspective, from a logical analysis, this is a self-defeating idea. That is, it is absurd by definition because it's rationally impossible. Then the third alternative we looked at was that the universe is self-existent or created by something ultimately that is self-existent. Now, with the concept of self-existence, we understand immediately that of the four alternatives, already we've established that there must be something, somewhere, somehow, that's self-existent because we've eliminated the others by the impossibility of the contrary. Now, then we're going to have to discuss where and what it is that is self-existent. But first of all, I want to just look at the concept of self-existence. And the first thing we want to ask is this question: is it possible for anything actually to be self-existent? We've seen that it's logically impossible for something to be self-created, again, because for something to create itself, it would have to exist before it was, and it would therefore have to be and not be at the same time in the same relationship. And so logic eliminates this as a rational possibility. Now I'm asking the question, is the idea of something's being self-existent and eternal a rational possibility? Now, there have been times in the past in the history of philosophy when some people have gone so far with reason that they have actually argued that if anything can be conceived of rationally, it must in fact exist in reality. That's not what we're going to be trying to demonstrate now. For example, I can conceive of the existence of a unicorn. We have the ability to abstract, combine, and relate ideas and disassemble them and then reassemble them, putting horns on the noses of horses and that sort of thing, borrowing from the rhinoceros, where we do see a horn on the nose of an animal, and we can transfer that to a duck if we want to, and conceive of a duck with a horn on its nose. Or you maybe have been in certain stores, sporting goods stores, where you will see on the wall the heads of deers and with their antlers, and then alongside of them you'll see a rabbit's head with antlers coming out of the top of it, because some taxidermist came up with the idea to implant deer's horns in the skull of a rabbit, as if somebody had actually shot a rabbit with a wonderful deer's rack on its head. That is, we can conceive by taking apart certain aspects of animals and reconfiguring them and coming up with ideas of rabbits with horns, or with the horse with the horn in terms of the unicorn. But just because it is rationally conceivable to have a unicorn does not mean that such animals exist. But you can't deny the possibility or the reality of unicorns on the grounds that they are rationally impossible. We've denied self-creation on the grounds that it is rationally impossible. So now we're asking now, is self-existence a rationally possible idea? Now, when we put together or side by side these two ideas, self-creation and self-existence, they seem so similar that some people will respond and say, well, if self-creation is rationally impossible, so self-existence must also be rationally impossible. And if we're going to account for reality, we're going to have to make a choice here between two rationally impossible or inconceivable ideas. And so what difference does it make whether you go to self-creation or self-existence? Well, here's the difference. There is nothing illogical whatsoever about the idea of a self-existent eternal being. That is, of a being that is not caused by something else. Remember, we said at the beginning that one of the problems we have in the discussion of the existence of God is that some people misunderstand the idea of the law of cause and effect, saying that it means that everything must have a cause. And I said, no, the law of causality says every effect must have a cause, because an effect by definition is that which has been produced by something outside of itself or beyond itself. But the idea of an uncaused being is perfectly rational. Now, just because we can conceive of an uncaused being, something that exists in and of itself from all eternity, that is not caused by something outside of itself, does not mean that it would indeed have to be, just because we can conceive of it. But all I'm saying at this point is that we can conceive of the idea of a self-existent eternal being without violating rationality. So I'm saying that reason allows for the possibility of this, while it does not allow for the possibility of self-creation. Now, I just said a moment ago that just because I can conceive of the rational possibility of a self-existent being does not mean that it in fact exists. Because theoretically, we could say that it is rationally conceivable that nothing would ever exist. Let me say it again. It is rationally conceivable that nothing exists now and nothing ever existed. However, once we take that step that we took at the very beginning of this construct, that if something exists, then that changes everything. Because if something exists, then the idea of self-existent being becomes not only possible, but necessary. Let me say it again. If there is anything that exists, now the idea of something that is self-existent becomes not merely a rational possibility, but it becomes a rational necessity. And so let me explore that idea in a little bit more detail by, again, putting the idea of self-existence, which in theology we call the attribute of aseity. That is, that something exists in and of itself. It is uncaused. It is uncreated. It differs from everything in the universe that has a cause, that is dependent or derived. And so this idea of a self-existent eternal being that has the power, or aseity, means it has the power to be in and of itself. Or another way of saying it is that it has the power of being in and of itself. It doesn't gain its existence or its being from something antecedent to itself, but it has it inherently. And because it has it inherently, it has it eternally. there was never a time that a self-existent being did not exist. If it did, then it would be not self-existent. It would have to have been created by something else. And so a self-existent being is, by definition, one that always has been. So, in any case, as we look at this idea of self-existence, we're now saying that it exists not only, possibly, from a viewpoint of reason, but also necessarily. Now, when St. Thomas Aquinas was arguing for the existence of God in his day, one of his 5 arguments was an argument for God from the principle of necessary being. So that in theology, God has been called the ens necessarium, that being whose being is necessary. Now, there can be a little bit of confusion at this point. It gets a little bit complicated, so we're going to have to think carefully now and closely. When philosophers and theologians speak about God as necessary being, there are 2 distinct ways in which God is described as a necessary being. The first way he's described as a necessary being is that he is necessary by virtue of rationality. Or to say that the existence of God, if anything exists, is rationally necessary. That is, if something exists now, reason demands that we come to the conclusion that something has always existed, that something somewhere has the power of being within itself, or we simply could not account for the existence of anything. Again, I remind you, if there was ever a time when there was nothing, absolutely nothing, what could there possibly be now? Except nothing. Because ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing, nothing can come, unless it comes by itself, creating itself, which is a rational impossibility. Now, I realize at this point that there are going to be people who say, wait a minute, science now shows you that you can have, through quantum physics and quantum mechanics, something coming from nothing. Science shows no such thing. Science shows things that are mysterious, things that you can't fit into your present paradigms. I'll agree with that. But to argue for something from nothing is not only not good theology, not good philosophy, it's not good science either, because it's manifestly absurd. So, but we know that something exists now. So that means there could never have been a time when there was absolutely nothing. There's always had to be something. Now, so far we haven't demonstrated that it's God, but we're only arguing at this point that there must be something that has the power of being within itself and has always been there. And because that is a being whose being is necessary logically. It's a logical necessity that we postulate such an idea of self-existent being. Again, we began with the rational possibility of self-existent being, but given the thesis that there is something that exists now rather than nothing, then that takes us to the next step, that there must be a self-existent being through rational necessity. So that when we talk about God being a necessary being, in the first instance, what we mean by that is that his existence is a necessity of rational postulation. Reason demands the existence of a self-existent eternal being. And that's very important for the Christian who's trying to defend their faith. Because let me just say as an aside right now, that the guns of criticism against Judeo-Christianity are aimed and focused almost exclusively at the idea of creation and the idea of a creator. Because if you can get rid of creation and get rid of a creator, then the whole concept of God collapses. And so people are trying to argue that if you're going to be rational and scientific, then you have to believe in a universe without God. What we're trying to do is turn the guns around and say to the people out there that are saying that, they need to turn the guns in on themselves and realize that what they are postulating as an alternative to full-bodied theism is manifest irrationality and absurdity. That reason demands that there be necessary being. But that's only one way in which we define the idea of necessary being. That is, it is rationally necessary. Now, the other way in which we define necessary being, as St. Thomas Aquinas did, is that this being, it has what we call ontological necessity. Now here it gets a little bit more abstract, a little more difficult if you're not a student of philosophy. I've already defined this term ontology before, but we're going to take the time to go over it again. Ontology is the study or the science of being. So when we say that God is ontologically necessary, we mean by that he exists by the necessity of his own being. He doesn't exist because reason says he has to exist. He exists eternally because he has the power of being in himself in such a way as that this being cannot not be. That's the difference between us and God. We say that God is the supreme being, and we say that we're human beings, but the difference between the supreme being and the human being is being. Is that my being or my existence is creaturely existence by which I am a dependent, derived, contingent creature. I cannot sustain myself forever. There was a time when I was not. There is a time when my life in the form in which I'm living it now will undergo some kind of transition. I will in fact die. Right now, for me to continue to exist in my present state, I need to have water, I need to have oxygen, and I need to have a heartbeat and brain waves and so on. I am dependent upon all of these things in order to continue to exist. 100 years ago, there was no R.C. Sproul. I did not exist. Now I exist. I have a beginning in time. And my life can be measured in terms of time. And not only that, but the whole process or progress of my life is a life of constant generation and decay, of change, of mutation, which is the supreme characteristic or attribute of contingent beings or creatures. They change constantly. Whereas that which has self-existent, eternal being is changeless, because it is never losing any of the power of its being, nor is it gaining anything in the scope of its being, because it is what it is eternally, and it's not that it borrows or adds something to itself after 500 years of eternity. It has being itself within its own power. That's what we mean by a self-existent eternal being whose being is ontologically necessary. That is, it cannot help but be. Pure being is dependent upon nothing for its continuity of existence or its origin of existence. It's not in a state of becoming, as Plato understood. It's in a state of pure being. And pure being cannot not be. That was behind, by the way, in shorthand thinking, Anselm's ontological argument that reflect an attribute only of one being, the most perfect being conceivable, can it be said of that being that it cannot not be. It must be in reality as well as in the mind, but that's another story. But in the meantime, this is the link we have with biblical theism. This is how God reveals himself with his sacred name to Moses in the Midianite wilderness. When God calls Moses out of the burning bush and sends him on this mission to Pharaoh to liberate the people of Israel. And Moses now, in his amazement, watching this bush that is burning but not being consumed, and hearing this voice speaking to him out of the bush, calling him by name, saying, "Moses, Moses, put off your shoes from off your feet, for the ground whereon you're standing is holy ground." Moses' first question he asks God is, "Who am I that I should do these things?" That's the first question he had. He wanted to know who he was. But then very quickly he moved to the big question when he says to God, "Who are you? Who shall I tell the people of Israel has authorized me to ask them to go on this act of rebellion against Pharaoh? Who shall I say to Pharaoh, says, 'Let my people go'?" And God answers him by giving him his sacred name, his memorial name, the name by which he is known from all generations, by saying to Moses, Yahweh, which being translated means, I am who I am. I am is sending you. You see, not I was, or I will be, or I'm in the process of change or becoming, but I am who I am. He uses the verb to be in the present tense. This is the name of God, the one whose being is always present, eternally present, and eternally unchanging, without whose being nothing else could possibly be. Now, does that self-existent eternal being have a name by the name of God, or is it the universe itself? Is it matter itself? That's what we'll look at in our next session.